Hi, I'm Celeste, and today is day 13 of 40 Days of Reflection. And I'm going to kind of carry on what I talked about yesterday and then perhaps what I'll talk about tomorrow. But last night, a person in one of the classes I take texted the group and said, "Hey, I just watched a documentary on Billy Graham. And I think it's called The Extraordinary Journey, but it's on Netflix, and it must be one of the new releases because it's high in the feed. And it's about an hour long. And she just said it was inspiring. So I watched it last night, and it really was inspiring. And it talked about two things that have been some of my ahas, my important discoveries, I guess, of this last year. And one is what I talked about yesterday, that God draws you, where in Billy Graham's interviews and discussion, he was a farm boy in North Carolina, dairy farm, and he didn't like manual labor, they said, but he didn't, his parents went to church, so he went to church, but it was very reluctantly. So he was schooled in church in a way, but he didn't connect with it. And his brother in the interview said the only two things he cared about were women and baseball, and he wasn't sure which order. So he was kind of just the normal high school kid doing his own thing, and God wasn't in the picture really. And then there was a preacher who came to do a revival, which at that time it took, I think he was going to be there several weeks. I don't remember how many weeks. And Billy Graham wasn't interested. I mean, everybody else was, I guess, small town, not a lot to do. But he didn't go for the first several days or weeks until he finally got curious what everybody was talking about. So he went with a bunch of friends, and he said there were a few thousand people there, and that impressed him. I mean, you'd never see that many people for a religious thing. And he was intrigued by what he heard. So he went back the next night and the next night. And I think he said it was like the final night that when the preacher was calling for people to come forth and declare themselves, he went forward. But even as he did it, he said he was thinking he was making a fool of himself with his friends. I mean, what's everyone going to think with him coming forward? But for whatever reason, he felt drawn to. So I think God was calling him. And that night when he got home, he said he didn't feel any different. And so he got on his knees for the first time ever, and he prayed. And he said one of the things he was missing that this guy talked about was relationship with God. And I think that's what I'll start tomorrow, because that was a new thing for me. It's not about just praying and just tossing the prayers out there and hoping for the best, or hoping they land somewhere, or even the shotgun approach, you pray for a bunch of things and hope something sticks. But it was about building a relationship with God as you're building it with a friend. And that was already on my list to talk about, because that was kind of huge for me. But it was interesting for me in that little hour. He talked about so many things that I would be discussing in the next 40 days, because they were all kind of ahas. He talked about being drawn to God, which I wanted to talk about. He talked about the relationship with God, that he had never understood that aspect of his faith, and yet that's critical. He talked about the calling to be an evangelist, and in the Bible that's one of the gifts. And it's again something that's really connected with me in the New Testament, is that there are gifts that God gives you, and Billy Graham was definitely given a gift of evangelism. And he talked about the Bible. There was a point in his career where his contemporaries were all deciding the Bible wasn't the authoritative truth that Billy had thought it was. And it was a real turning point for him, because he was really struggling that the feeling of the current group, his generation, were saying that was old school, and you really couldn't trust the Bible in its entirety. And that was something that Billy really, really struggled with. But he came to the point after a lot of prayer that they were off base. The Bible was the truth. The Bible had the answers, and that became a turning point for him in going forward. And another thing that happened in the California revival, and he was blessed by, I think it's Randolph Hearst, the big publisher. For whatever reason, he decided he was a good guy to write about. So once Hearst decided he was a good guy to write about in his publications than all the other media did. So from that standpoint, his ministry really took off. But I think that relationship that we'll talk about tomorrow and the calling. So I think God drawing you, I wanted to again double up on that because I do believe God does draw us somehow. And that Billy Graham didn't come out of the womb believing in God and feeling like he wanted to share God with the world. He was called, and he was called when he was a young man. And he said he argued with God. He just couldn't see why he would be used for these things. But as long as God was willing to use him, he was willing to step in line and follow him. So anyway, I just thought I would point that out today as a strengthening of yesterday's message. God does call us. And we're not always listening, but he is calling, and he's patient. That's it for today. As always, grab your cup of tea, sit back, and let's start sharing. Until next time, bye-bye.